basically what we're gonna do today is kind of try and have some fun and take a little trip down memory lane for a little bit and then see how those topics can apply to maybe where we're going in the future with some of this content and really start trying to think about where we probably should be going. So this is called the past, present, and future of post-production. And we're gonna start from the very beginning, which is a guy literally holding a piece of film, and he's going to cut these and assemble these pieces of physical material together that's then going to project onto a wall. All of this lives in the actual physical world, which is really weird when you think about it, because we don't do that anymore. And they're gonna cut these by hand, and it's going to be expensive, and it's going to be limited to a very small group of people who are able to understand the arcane idea of how these physical moving pictures are going to be strung together with separately recorded pieces of sound tape and projected through some sort of crazy machine onto a wall. It's very, very difficult to make a movie, and what you find then is, because it's so difficult to make a movie, that there is only a few studio systems and film schools that are able to teach this subject matter. So there's very few people who can actually make a moving picture. And because of that, you have tight control over what gets made. There's very few people who can actually greenlight a movie because they're so expensive. And when that happens, that means very few stories can actually be told. And the only way for people to then see any of these moving pictures is for people to pay to go to a dark room and sit there and experience something that's being projected, or to have 3 channels basically in the US where you have to tune into one of these places where someone has greenlit this show separately to then go and project with these very expensive crews. And so there's this giant organism. That's really the thing, in order preventing people from telling their story to the world. And coincidentally though, because of this workflow, the one interesting thing that was unique about it was that because everything lived in the physical world and it was all assembled basically by hand, you literally were able to work at the speed of thought. There was no waiting to render. There was no waiting for these technical things, figuring out what format it was. It was, here's this thing, I'm gonna connect it to this thing with my hands, and I'm gonna string it together, and I'm gonna show it. And that's very different from the world that we live in now. And it got really bad in the 1980s to 1990s. If you look at this room, how many of you guys remember something like that? Really, really simple, right? Does anyone, if you walked into a room now to try and use this, would anyone have any idea how to do that? There's like 3 people. There's there was like digibeta. Does anyone have any idea how a digibeta works anymore? We got, but it's crazy to think about that this was like the modern standard. This was like the way stuff sort of got done for a very long time, you know? But what was interesting about it is, for the first time, it lowered the cost and it made some of this kind of accessible. You know, like you had, hobbyists and certain other things with their little home video cameras that you would sort of shoot on VHS. You had VHS and DVD that suddenly came to the home theater where you could finally watch a movie at home. Now the resolution wasn't the same, it wasn't as good, it wasn't as high quality an experience, but for the first time you could experience something that you'd seen in a giant theater at home. And that was when you had all the crazy piracy ideas of people, dubbing VHSs, and that was like a crazy thing that people went through for a while. And then there was cable television that came out because you had new ways and different ways of sort of screening and projecting these things. Cable television added 57 channels with nothing on, which was the Bruce Springsteen idea. And suddenly there was like too many things to watch, because you had 57 channels on cable. And what also was interesting is this was the beginning when you were able to edit footage digitally. So, how many of you guys remember Clerks and El Mariachi? this was like a big deal. These were cheap independent films that could be made for $7,000 to $50,000. People were really proud of Kevin Smith because he only went $90,000 into debt on Clerks. And like, think about how expensive that is to turn out a feature film. And think about if you watch the quality of Clerks, now, like, that would get laughed out of the room. An independent film that would be made like Clerks, which was a huge deal, that people went to the theater to see this groundbreaking thing, would not even be remotely impressive. It'd be like, dude, just use Final Cut, you know? And like, it's like, that's the world that we were in the 1990s. And, you know, I don't think people would really like taken that into consideration when they see sort of what's happening. And the key thing here is in the 1990s was kind of the golden age of complexity for the post house, because they were the only ones who knew how to use that. So you had to go to a post house and figure out how to get onto Digibeta or how to get to whatever it is you were gonna do, and you could make a ton of money renting this out. Like deck rental was like, that was just a fantastic way to make money. So, and part of it was because the knowledge was still like present to a very small group of people. So then you go to the year 2000 and suddenly this stuff starts to change a little bit, and Final Cut democratizes post-production. This is right when I was in film school and getting out, and I figured out that I could actually make a movie at home instead of having to go into the Avid lab at NYU. And you know, and then suddenly I moved over to Final Cut specifically for that reason, because I didn't want to have to walk over to the Avid lab. I just wanted to edit it at home, you know, and I wanted to be able to do this. And then what was really frustrating about that was having to digitize the footage through that Sony DV-Cam deck, which was awful. But it was like a big deal, and everyone had one of those, and it was like a couple $1,000s, and this was like a big deal that you could like have a DV cam deck where you could have this at home. I made an entire documentary with one of these things. And then those cards started coming, and that seemed really weird. And you had these CF cards, and you had the red drive, and suddenly you were able to get something better than an SD resolution image out of a video camera, and you were able to suddenly have a 4K resolution image from a red camera, and you were able to start working with this. And I made an entire feature film this way, and it was great, but it also cost $400,000 to do this when you put all of these things together and you made a feature film. But what was also interesting is suddenly that was way less than the $3 to $5 million that was required to make a independent feature film, which was what it cost at the time. If you wanted to make the most bare bone independent feature film, was $3 to $5 million. That was like a discount. That was doing things really intelligently. And a lot of that was because of what started to happen with HD and 1080 video and the post-production that started to come into that. People were able to save a lot of money doing that. The only problem was that the digital formats became everywhere, and the technical problems, people completely stopped working at the speed of thought because it was not designed to work this way. It was designed to be complicated because no one had really thought through the actual process of creating content. There was DV cam, there was mini DV tapes that like what was the HDV, that codec, that was the worst thing that was ever invented. And there was like H.264 was like a big deal, but you couldn't actually edit with it, you know? And then you had to figure out what the compression settings were for H.264. And there are all these unnecessary things that you had to think about just to actually make a piece of content that you used to be able to make with like your hands, and you'd take one piece of film and connect it with another. But suddenly there was like 9 billion things that you had to think about, all of which was getting in the way of just turning out a stupid 3-minute video. And this was really complicated. But then this thing called iMovie comes along, and this concept of easily making something is created, and you suddenly have a bunch of kids who are starting to learn how to put video images together. And so film schools and festivals and indie films suddenly start popping up everywhere, and like people think you can make an affordable movie now, and this is where this concept of the idea that you could actually do this too sort of becomes introduced, and you don't have to go and have this giant long apprenticeship. So And then you find out that you can just put your video out into the world and anyone can see it on YouTube and iTunes. And so this marks the beginning of the end of the post house as we knew it, which is when people figured out that they could do it themselves. And the only problem was that no one enjoyed the experience because everything was so complicated to do anything at high quality. That brings us to sort of the present, which is everything is now changing. So this is all just commonplace, all of the stuff that we saw on the last slide. And what's happening now is that Hollywood cannot make a middle tier movie anymore because no one's going to see them. They're only manufacturing Hollywood movies that are designed to go to China and make a lot of money because apparently China really enjoys blockbuster films while no one in the US does. But it's all designed for lowest common denominator foreign box office, and that's sort of where we are at the high end. The idea of character-driven films is now dead from Hollywood because they're no longer profitable, because independent films have sort of cut out the bottom of that market and it's hard to separate them. So what you also have is Netflix, Hulu, YouTube, and Amazon have now completely caused cord cutting where the entire model of cable television and advertising is completely shifting. 4K and HDR are creating a new really complicated spec that no one understands and is now creating a new sense of complexity for people, and that's where a lot of the money is now going, and so people can retain some of this high level of conceptual filmmaking. But what's also interesting is new workflows are happening where, for instance, collaborative workflow is no longer the prisoner of a server room. That's why we have a company called LumaForge and we make the jellyfish, because you can now have an in-house content department do what a post house did, and all of your workflow, your editors, colorists, sound designers can all be working from the original media in one place, and this can happen at a company. You know, this can happen we have a customer, Hormel, and they're doing in-house content. In-house, everyone's working from the same place. They don't have to go anywhere else. Like the technology and the software is now at a place where everyone can be easily working together. And, you know, iMovie, the way I sort of see, and if you notice, I have a 2010 to 2020, because I see this happening over the next couple of years, where you're going to have iMovie and Final Cut basically come in for the independent filmmaker and the smaller business because they're easy to use and understand. They're going to come in from the bottom up. So what you have now is, from the bottom end, you have an entire world of people who are learning video for the first time and are now assembling all kinds of different content. iMovie and Final Cut 10 are enabling that. Meanwhile, Avid is going to completely lose its market share to Premiere and Resolve at the top end, and you now have extremely powerful, extremely affordable video editing software designed for all different levels of people, where content on the digital side is finally matching where we were with analog, where you no longer have to worry about all of the technical side of things. You can now assemble content digitally the way you used to be able to do it with your hands. And what this is going to mean is that Hollywood is no longer the only place where high-level content gets made. Hollywood is everywhere now. Hollywood is in Mexico City, it's in India, it's in China, it's in Europe. It is everywhere. So the real question is, where are the best content creators going to go? And now it's going to become far more regional than it was global. And the one thing that's also happening in the present is pretty much 3D is dead. I think we can all agree on that, right? Does anyone disagree? This was 3D was like a really big deal like 3 or 4 years ago, by the way. Everyone thought this was the future, but it's dead now. No one raised their hand. So, and I think what's interesting though is being replaced by virtual reality and augmented reality. And I think those are going to point to where people want to go, but I don't think people actually want the experience of putting on goggles and being in another world. So we'll touch on that in a second. But here are the key takeaways of sort of what we've learned, which is that there is nothing preventing anybody from being a filmmaker in this day and age. Anybody can actually do it. The technology has lowered the cost and the barrier of entry where everyone can now make their story. So the other lesson that that's taught us kind of is that scarcity creates complexity, which is basically the scarcity of resources, or having really expensive things creates a fundamental lack of knowledge and understanding that prevents people from getting things done, and it causes inaction. It causes people to be unable to do what they want to do. When you suddenly have available knowledge and technology, pretty much you have the previous slide, which is anybody can do anything. And when you think about that, when everything is now available and anybody can do anything, what really matters is end-to-end workflow. When you're going to create a moving image and you're going to move at the speed of thought, you have to think through every aspect of the story, which is pre-production into production, into post, into delivery. All of this works together. There is no separation of jobs anymore if you want to make something at a high quality. Complexity used to hide incompetence, but like there's no room for incompetence anymore if you want to get something done. You have to tie all of these different departments together now in order to create something that's going to be competitive and that people want to see. So you have to think through the entire aspect of how you're making something if you want people to care in a world of too much video. So essentially what the last 30 years have been is like 2 steps back for a giant leap forward into the future. And now we're entering a world where everyone's going to learn how to make content with your phone. So the new iPhone X is coming out in a minute, but I can do 4K. I can make a 4K movie with this, and it's in my pocket. That's crazy when you think about it. And this is the way people are going to start learning, is they're going to start learning with an iPhone, and they can learn the basics of storytelling that used to cost people, that there are lots of kids who are $150,000 in debt going to film school, and you have kids now who have the opportunity to learn the same thing in film school with their iPhone and start learning the basis of storytelling and start bringing that into iMovie and Final Cut and start assembling their stories and learning how to tell stories, where then they can assemble a boom mic and a couple other things around their iPhone, and they can start learning a more advanced version of that process. And then they can get their friends involved and they get really good at that, and that's cost them less than $1,000. And then they can attach a Red camera to this instead of the iPhone, and suddenly there's Spielberg, and this costs them almost nothing, except instead of making a really bad independent film and taking a belly flop into debt like most filmmakers used to do on the independent side, you can actually learn your craft and be ready to make something at a really high quality and not have to lose all of your money in the process. So this is kind of a groundbreaking shift for people, and I think we're going to start seeing a lot more intelligent voices come out, and different voices that we haven't heard from in the past, because video education is now going to start with what's in your pocket as opposed to an expensive film school. And so what that's going to lead to is video becoming a new form of literacy, which is everyone is going to know, like everyone's already doing this, which is people are sending, Snapchat is a thing. This is how people are already communicating. They're communicating with Snapchat. And so they're going to now start communicating with short films, and they're going to start, instead of having to know 9 million different languages, everyone understands a video. So you can communicate, like what happens when people start communicating this way and they start, sharing videos instead of maybe long-winded emails. This is a thing when everyone knows how to do something, then it becomes a form of literacy, and it doesn't just need to be the written word. And so what happens when everyone is making videos? The only ones you're actually going to watch are going to be the ones that are recommended to you. And the only ones people are going to recommend to you are actually the good ones. So you better learn how to make a quality video, and you better learn how to understand the aspects of video if you want anyone to watch what you're going to do. Because marketing is going to stop mattering when there is literally more content updated to YouTube in an hour than you can watch in your entire lifetime. So quality is going to be what determines curation, because who's going to want to waste their time in a world with too many choices on stuff that isn't very good? So if you want, anybody can now make a film, you had better make it good if you want anyone to actually care. And this is the big thing that people really need to wrap their heads around, is you have to actually care about what you're doing now, and you have to execute it in a way, because everyone now has these tools. So basically what that means is that craft is going to become really emphasized, and a lot of the things that we've sort of forgotten when it comes to technology, which is lighting, storyboarding, blocking, composition, screenwriting, and like really coming up with interesting characters and stories, and actually having a plan when you go on set that's going to plan for post-production into delivery. All of these things are going to really start mattering again, because the size of your budget matters less than actually whether you're any good. And so additionally, what's going to happen is, as the speed of internet increases, we're all going to start working from the cloud, because while I do make a server company, the reality is, like, people are now connected all over the world. So like my server may get connected out to someone with a gigabit or 10 gig connection over Ethernet in, you know, China or India, and you're going to be able to collaborate with video in a pretty seamless way. And it's not going to matter what resolution you shot at. People are going to start editing with proxies and return to the original media. So all of these concepts of workflows that we have in our minds, like, the technology is going to kind of remove the barriers for this. So the real question is, how do you want to work? When you can do anything, what is the best way to work? And I think for the most part, people are going to decide they want to work collaboratively with people around them, because it's a lot more efficient than having these weird arbitrary communications. But you can work remotely when you need to, and you can really choose who you want to work with. So if you look around this room, right, I know a lot of people in this room, and I shouldn't know most of the people in this room because I've been to IBC 3 times. But there's this thing called Facebook where I know all of these people, and now I can actually collaborate with you no matter where you are. And now I can really choose who I want to work with. And I think that's a really interesting concept. And this is where, you know, basically, you know, what's happening right now is, I think people are far more interested. Like, I think technology has become very alienating for a lot of people, where it sort of forced them to not connect with other human beings. But I think the main issue with the cinema at the moment is that it doesn't, there's not a big differentiation. It hasn't changed in like 20 or 30 years. Where you're going to come in and see a movie on a bigger screen than you have in your TV, and you've got to listen to a bunch of people who you don't actually like sit around you and laugh and snort and, you know, eat candy. Where I think in the future, you're going to have, when anybody can be a filmmaker, that means you're going to have friends getting together and making movies together that then they're going to want to screen in a setting. So this is literally a picture of what happens in LA in the summer, where people come to the Hollywood Forever Cemetery and they project old movies on this amazing screen. How many of you see this many people in the theater when you go to the latest blockbuster release? Nobody. But people show up to watch The Wizard of Oz in the park, and they pay to see this. And so think about that conceptually. They want to get together and have a picnic outside, and you can see an amazing movie presented to you anywhere now. So the setting, the idea that we have to watch movies in a multiplex is no longer a thing. You could have the world's most amazing barbecue where your friends are screening Steven Spielberg quality movies in your backyard with a 4K projector that you bought for a couple $1,000s. So, and you can plug in with an HDMI and screen your ProRes master. You don't need a DCP. This is how we already screen things at We Make Movies. So the idea that we suddenly are trapped in all of these existing modes of exhibition is no longer like a thing. We can do whatever we want now. So the question is, what are people going to choose to do? I think they're probably going to choose to hang out with their friends and watch content because it's a lot more fun. And, you know, this is probably the most important slide of the whole thing, which is, that's the guy from Office Space. He doesn't care about his job whatsoever. All he wants to do is get out, and he's extremely sad. And the main reason for all of these things is because he literally has no passion for what he's doing. He's pushing paper, whereas we all talk about Elon Musk, and the reason that we talk about him is because he's pushing the barriers and, you know, solving problems. So for us as post people, the real question that we have to ask ourselves is, are we solving problems? And if we're solving problems, there's going to be a job for us. If we're in the way and we're refusing to learn and change, when you can hire anyone on this planet, why would anyone hire you if all you're doing is getting in the way of like progress? So that's the thing that like we need to ask ourselves is like, are we solving problems for the people that we're working with? And that's really how you're going to make money in the future, because if you're sort of following technology and where some of these things are going, there's always going to be a problem to be solved. A lot of people worry about automation, but like, how many people think all of the problems in this world have been solved? I mean, like, I'm in the States. We have a lot of problems to be solved right now. And, you know, the more that we start focusing on solving them and allowing technology to automate some of the stuff, us pushing the same stupid button every time and getting paid for it, I think the better off this world is actually going to be. So, you know, all these things are good things because it frees us up to focus on the things that are actually matter or that are actually important to us. And that's like the thing that I think a lot of people don't understand is like, that's what technology should do. And, you know, the last little thing that I sort of see coming is this. So I mentioned that VR and AR are probably going to point the direction towards where things might be going. But if you think about it, like how many of you really want to put on a headset to experience VR? And how many of you want to wear the Google glasses? Not a single person raised their hand, so it's probably not going to catch on, right? However, like, wouldn't it be kind of cool if like I could do this 360 workflow and have a projector that was sort of set up with an augmented reality sort of world or space, and like I could have the Star Wars hologram on my desk. And that's where like I think something would, I don't think people want a different reality. I think they want a better version of the reality that they're in. And if we could, you know, I think that would actually be a cool thing if VR was on a desk instead of like on some stupid headset. And in terms of where I think we might be going and where some of these technologies should be going, it probably should be heading towards a virtual realization of pixels in a way where like I can play chess on a real physical board with some of these things, and it's interesting and cool, and it's in my reality. And when you think about augmented reality in the theater and some of that stuff, like you can have these projectors and these things sort of, and it's going to enhance the experience, but it's not going to take you out of your reality. And I think that is sort of the big direction that a lot of this stuff will probably go. So, you know, I think in terms of where the future is going to be, it's anybody can make a 2D movie and they can do it really easily and really effectively, and the gear is mattering less and less, and it's more about, are you actually good at making content? And then in terms of where the future of actually like formats and content is going, it's taking all of these VR and AR concepts and bringing them into the physical world in a way that people actually want to experience them. So anyway, that's just my opinion, but thank you guys for your time, and hope you have a great IBC.